All right, everyone. So we are moving on to topic 6.7. This is the effects of migration. And if you haven't watched 6.6 yet, I would encourage you to do that first because this is going to relate directly to some of the things and themes that we talked about in 6.6. But our essential question for today is going to be identify and explain the effects of global migrations during the period of 1750 to 1900. So this is one part of the curriculum that I'm not going to dive into a whole lot of depth about, but it is something that you should note as a historical trend that does happen. Is as migrants tend to be mostly male, it ends up leaving women holding up new roles in their home society. That had been formerly occupied by men. So you're starting to see more egalitarian, especially in economics, for the women in some of these countries where you have large scale migrations of countries that are people are leaving to go to other places, and women are gaining more economic and social and political opportunities as well. But this is something that I will dive into a little bit more with some specific examples, and that is migrants often created ethnic enclaves in different parts of the world that help transplant their culture into new environments. So let's start with the Chinese. And the Chinese moved all over the world, and a lot of things that is driving away the Chinese from their home country. The occupation by foreign powers, the opioid crisis that's going on there, and then at the same time there is the Taipei Rebellion, which was probably the worst civil war in history. And it's driving them out away from their country, and they are going to be diasporic in different parts of the world. And so one area that they are very successful in would be Southeast Asia. And they would move into the colonies of the French and the British, and they would come there originally as unskilled laborers. But over time, they began to engage more into commerce, gaining enough wealth and power that eventually many of them end up occupying high positions of authority within the colonial governments that were there. And so by the end of the 19th century, many of the Chinese migrants and or their descendants ended up controlling much of the Southeast Asian trade that goes on within this region. And if you've ever seen the movie Crazy Rich Asians, in that movie, there's a part where the mother's talking about their family history, and it really relates to what we're talking about here, is that they descended from the Chinese migrants and become very, very wealthy. But Southeast Asia isn't the only place that Chinese would end up moving to. Many of them moved to the Americas, and in 1849, many of them came during the California Gold Rush. But over time, many of them come to help, build the railroads. They sign contracts to work on the railroads, and the Transcontinental Railroad, in particularly, was a railroad that was built across the length of the country. Something you probably learned about in Utah history, but this is a huge project for the United States, and many of the laborers that were building the railroad through the mountains and the more difficult part from the west towards the east were Chinese laborers. So, they put them in very dangerous jobs of building the railroad, blowing holes into the sides of mountains to create tunnels, using highly unstable explosives like nitroglycerin. But many laborers, will go to other parts of the world as well. Many of them work in sugar plantations in Cuba, and there's a number of other places you can say the Chinese did move to. But regardless of where they moved to, they always seem to create these ethnic enclaves. And so you'll find Chinatowns still today all over the world. And, within these towns, it's these areas, it's not just kind of a tourist destination as many people think of them today. It truly is trying to maintain and hold on to their cultural identity. And so, there's Chinatowns in San Francisco, there's a Chinatown in New York that I got to go to. And from my own personal experience, I can say that it really is Chinatown. You turn around the corner and you go in Chinatown, it's like going to a whole new country. Mandarin Chinese is spoken, all the signs are in Mandarin Chinese. And so this is something that was that happened, and still the remnants of that on the cultural landscape still exist. Another group that largely migrated during this time were South Asian Indians, right? So India is largely populated. It's become a British colony, and so for that, there's need for workers in different parts of the British Empire and other places. And so many Indians are going to sign into indentured servitude contracts that will put them all over the world. And the graph that you see onto the screen there is a good representation of where many of them do end up in terms of numbers. And as they occupy and take more and more people there, they create enclaves that hold on to their own cultural identity, practicing Hinduism and other things that come with their culture. But that is something that did occur, and so and even today, you still have a large number of people who live in these countries and have assimilated in a way into the countries in the world as well. A lot of migrants moved to South Africa as well, and including a young lawyer who went there to kind of cut his teeth in the law practice was Mahatma Gandhi, and he will end up fighting for against some of the racial policies of the apartheid that existed in South Africa. But eventually he turns back home and he plays a significant role in the independence movement that India becomes independent from Britain. But that's something we're going to talk about in another time period in our class. So the Irish in North America, and we talked about how the Irish are going to move here, primarily the big spike coming during the potato famine. And they are going to work lots of jobs within factories. And they came here dirt poor, so any type of work is something that they will be taking. But a lot of them, as far as the effects, help build and help with the industrialization of the United States by building so many of the infrastructure projects. The canal systems were largely built by migrant workers from Ireland. And so the most famous of the canals that were built was the Erie Canal. Of course, the canal system is not something we really use today. It gets replaced by the railroads, which they have a hand in building as well, including the Transcontinental Railroad. And the majority of workers that that helped build the railroad from the east towards the west, eventually meeting in the middle of Utah, were Irish immigrants. And so they are going to play a significant role with that. And so the first generation of Irish immigrants, when they first come here, generally came as unskilled workers. But by the second generation of immigrants, they are rising the socioeconomic ladder and becoming skilled blue-collar workers as well as white-collar workers. And a lot of people don't remember this or really appreciate it today, but when John F. Kennedy, who was the first Irish Catholic to be elected the president of the United States, when that happened in 1960, it really kind of showed how far the Irish had come within 100 years of being in this country. And they came here dirt poor, so many of them, and eventually rose to where they can have someone in the office of the president. So that was kind of a significant thing. So I mentioned this in the last I think I mentioned in the last lecture that so many Irish came here and stayed and settled in the United States that more people of Irish descent are living in the United States than are living in Ireland as a whole. And you can see that every year the national holiday that's practiced and recognized would be St. Patrick's Day. And while most people don't really know what St. Patrick's Day truly is about celebrating, one thing is for sure is that it's relating to the Irish. And so that's something that, the Irish become part of what America is today. Now, receiving societies did not always embrace immigrants, as seen in the various degrees of ethnic and racial prejudices and the ways the states attempted to regulate the increased flow of people across their borders. So every time you see, not every time, but many times you see when you have large amounts of migrants coming into a country, there is going to be a reaction from the people who are already living there. This is something we call nativism. And nativism happens for a number of reasons. It can be, economic anxiety, where the fear that they're coming to take jobs away from people who are already living there, or they all work for wages that are so low that will make it difficult for people who are already living here to compete and to be able to live a higher standard of living. There's definitely racism that's kind of involved, prior prejudices. Xenophobia is a term that is commonly used. It's a fear of foreign peoples. And these attitudes don't change in history. You can find examples of them even still today. But when it comes to this whole reaction, you need evidence to really support that this is happening. Sometimes these xenophobic feelings turn into certain events that occur that become kind of targeting immigrants through maybe violence. But the ones we're going to talk about today end up becoming government policies. And so the first one is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I would like to take myself out of the picture here. But Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882 in the United States. And when the Chinese came here to work on the railroads and other jobs, many of them people felt that they were supposed to leave after they had finished their projects. And when that didn't happen, there is going to be more competition for jobs after the railroads are built, and so that kind of leads to nativist responses and such, eventually leading to a government policy that is going to be the first in the United States history to target a specific immigrant group. And so this banned Chinese immigration, but also prohibited state and local governments to be able to hire Chinese workers. It prevented them to a path of citizenship. It also encouraged that cities and towns segregate Chinese away from the rest of the population too. So this was something of it's a good example because it's a government policy that was fiercely anti-immigrant, especially about one particular group, which would be the Chinese. This wasn't repealed until 1943. At that time, the United States is engaged in World War II. Our allies are China. We have Chinese Americans who are serving the armed forces. And so, that was probably why it ends up being repealed altogether. And another policy, the government policy that is a good example of like the, sometimes the immigrants weren't welcomed in new countries is the white Australian policy. And this came about in the midst of the gold rush that happens in Australia. While many of the Chinese migrant workers moved to Australia to partake in the gold rush, there's going to be a reaction, a response from the Australian government, and this is going to be about trying to stop the flow of Chinese immigrants into Australia. However, the policy itself would also be used to justify the systematic removal of the indigenous Aborigines people. And I would dare say that what occurs would be a form of ethnic cleansing. And a lot of that ties to that the white Australian policy kind of establishes the idea that Australia is a white country. And so this itself did not get repealed until 1973. So another good example of an anti-immigrant policy, one that had dire consequences on the populations of the indigenous people that lived in Australia. All right, so the essential question for today is identify and explain the effects of the global migrations during the period 1750 to 1900. So make sure you answer this in Canvas. This concludes Unit 6. And so we are going to move on to our next unit after we test. And it's going to be about global conflict, which is going to be about, all the world wars and Cold War and such. It's going to be very heavy. So with that being said, this is Mr. Henry signing off.